Well, I am not built for cross country. This body was not made to run. To eat potato chips, to watch baseball, but not to run. I learned that at a young age. I was in 3rd grade. It was field day, and one of the events was a half-mile run. I remember I didn't know what a mile was, but I figured a half of anything can't be that far, and I signed up. I thought, I'm going to impress all the girls in my class, and I'm going to run this half mile. And I got out there, and they said go, and we were supposed to run down a 1/4 mile to where the teacher was standing, turn around and come back, and the winner would get a ribbon. I took off running. I was probably a good 10, 12, 15 steps into it, and I realized I can't even see that teacher, and she just marks the halfway point. As pain set into my legs, I got discouraged, and I quit. All those girls I wanted to impress ran right by me, and I stood there in shame as they ran the half mile that I had signed up for. You know, years later, when Carrie was pregnant with our first son, she's a runner. She likes to run, and she was running to stay in shape, and she talked me into doing the Cowtown 5K. And this time I knew how far a 5K was, and somehow I still agreed to do it. And our plan was we trained a little bit, and Charles Stoffus was going to run it with us. My brother-in-law, Carrie's brother, Davis, was going to run it with us as well. He lived in our house. In fact, the night before, he hadn't done any training. And the night before, he goes, well, how far is the 5K? We said, well, it's a little more than 3 miles. He said, well, that's not far enough. Is there anything further? I said, well, it's 10K. He said, how far is that? And I said, well, it's double. It's 6 miles. And he said, well, I'm going to go try that. So he had flip-flops on. He went out and ran around the neighborhood and ran 6 miles the night before a race. And I thought, he's not going to be able to get out of bed in the morning. And but he did it, and we went to the race, and everything started out great. We took off. And I'll tell you, Fort Worth is a lot hillier on foot than it is in a car. And we were running those hills, and I was going, and I was doing all right. As we were coming up a hill, I saw there was a volunteer lady up there, and she was going, you're doing great, you're doing great. She was kind of cheering us all on. And I thought, I got to be getting near the end. So I started pressing hard, and I ran up that hill. And right as I got there, the guy in front said, how far are we? And I heard her say possibly the 2 most discouraging words I've ever heard in my life. She said, 2 miles. I said, 2 miles? I thought I was done. And I said, you know what? I am done. And in frustration, I quit. And right there on top of the hill, I stopped running. I was frustrated. I was angry. I was angry my wife had signed me up for the race. I was angry at the hills. I was angry at the woman for talking. I was angry at the guy for asking the question how far we was gone. I was angry at everybody. I was really angry at all the people that were passing me. And then it happened. My 5-month pregnant wife ran by. And you guys that know Carrie, y'all know her as this sweet, encouraging person. That's not the wife that ran by me. As she ran by me, she punched me and said, hey, come on, slowpoke, what are you doing? And I was ashamed, and I slowly started to run again. As I ran that last mile and I approached the finish line, there waiting for me was Charles Stoffus, my brother-in-law Davis, who'd already finished the 10K, and my wife. And when I crossed that line, the only place I've ever seen my wife run faster than she did that last mile was to a payphone to call my dad and say, listen to what your son just did. And she rubbed it in. But the shame kept coming. A week later, if you've ever run those races, they'll send you a picture of your glorious finish. And I get this proof in the mail, and it's a picture of me, and I had a gray sweatshirt on. I can still see it. I had sweat stains everywhere, and my head was hung, and my feet are barely moving, and I'm crossing the finish line. But one step in front of me was a girl that couldn't have been 7 years old. And she's crossing the finish line with both hands in the air, smile on her face, and neither foot was touching the ground. She was jumping across the finish line. I'm sure that to this day, there's a 22-year-old girl somewhere with a picture of her crossing that Cowtown finish line, and she's always wondered, who is that sweaty old guy in the background of my picture? Persistent pain in my knees and my side have caused me, whether it's on a treadmill or whether it's running the Cowtown or it's just running by myself, it has persistently caused me to quit running. But it's not just running that I struggle. Persistent pain in any area of life can be a discouragement, and it can cause me to quit. And I know I'm not alone in that. I know people in this congregation who are enduring prolonged illness, their marital difficulties, family troubles, maybe with a child, tough situations at work, maybe stressful relationships, even here in this church body. And the tendency is when we face that prolonged, difficult, painful struggle, our desire is we want it to end. We want to quit. We want to stop. We just want the pain to go away. And the truth is, I think life gets hard for all of us. And I've seen many of us, myself included, that when the pain gets hard enough, we'll make bad decisions simply to make it stop. And the book of Hebrews is written to an audience who was in that exact situation. They had been facing prolonged suffering. They had gone through many hard situations, men and women who had been hurting for an extended period. And now they were facing renewed persecution and difficulty. The pain was increasing, not lessening, and they were getting discouraged. Their circumstances had worn them down, and they were questioning God, and they were questioning their faith. In fact, the only thing their faith had ever gotten them was trouble. And these Hebrew Christians were ready just to call it quits. The whole book of Hebrews is really an encouragement letter. The author is writing to these Christians who have gone through a long season of repeated suffering, and he's encouraging them, you remain faithful, you don't quit. And he does it by telling them in the first 9.5 chapters of the book, he tells them that Christ is greater than anything they would quit and go back to. These Christians were of a Jewish background, and they were tempted to go back to their Judaism so that people would stop persecuting them. And he says that Christianity, that Christ is superior to anything they go back to. In fact, he takes the 4 main points of Judaism, and he says Christ is greater than each of these. In chapter 1 and 2, he says Christ is greater than the Old Testament prophets. Christ is greater than the angels. And then he gives them a warning, you don't go back. Chapter 3, he says, Christ is greater than Moses and the law. And he gives them a warning, you don't go back, the second warning. In chapters 4 through 7, he tells them Christ is greater than Aaron and the priests that were mediators between Old Testament saints and God. Christ is a better mediator. And he gives them a warning, you don't go back. And then in chapter 8 through the middle of chapter 10, he says Christ is greater than the old covenant. And he gives them a 4th warning. You don't go back. Because everything in these Christians said, I want to quit. I want to go back. I want the pain to stop. Beginning in the middle of chapter 10, the author of the book changes a little bit. And he talks now not about Christ's superiority, but about what Christ's superiority should mean in the life of a Christian. How does it practically apply to Christians on an everyday basis? In verses 22 to 25 of chapter 10, he gives 3 commands to his readers. He says you need to grow in verse 22 in your faith. In 23, you need to grow in your hope. And in 25, you need to grow in your love. And then he gives a 5th warning. He says, don't fall away. Don't you quit. And that warning, I think it's interesting, that warning is in very general terms. In fact, in chapter 10, verse 28, he says, anyone who would abandon their faith, just a generic sense of any man, any woman who would abandon their faith. And then in verse 29, he speaks in the 3rd person. He says, that man who would abandon his faith is in danger. And it's this general 3rd person warning that applies to anyone. But what we want to look at today begins in verse 32. Because you see, the author of the book of Hebrews is not just a writer, he's a pastor. And he's concerned about his audience. And he knows that they have a specific situation where they're dealing with suffering. And so he no longer talks about anyone. But in verse 32, he starts talking about you. And he gives commands to you, his readers, and to us, those who read the book even today. He comes alongside his readers, and he really gives them 3 commands. And we're going to look at those 3 commands today. The first is in verses 32 to 34 of chapter 10. And he says, you remember your past. Then in 35 and 36, you stand firm in your present. And then in chapter 10, verse 37 to 39, he says, you look forward to your future. And so look with me at verse 32. We'll see the first of these commands. You remember your past. It's actually there in the first couple of words, but you remember. Christians in the New Testament are often told to remember, but usually they're told to remember something they've been taught before. Paul often says that, remember what you've been taught. Or they're told to remember something that Christ has done as their example. But here's the only time in the New Testament where Christians are commanded to remember, it says, your former days. They're commanded to remember their own past. And in the next 2.5 verses, he gives 4 specific details he wants them to remember. The first is what about their past, or when in their past they're supposed to remember. Look at the time period. He says, you remember the former days when after being enlightened. See, it's not just a simple case of these believers are going through a hard time. So he says, you remember the good old days. You remember back there, God was gracious in the past when you didn't have suffering. No, he's not pointing them back to the good old days to remember how it used to be. What he's pointing them to is, you remember a time right after you became a Christian. That's when I want you to focus on, is after you became a Christian. And then this is what I want you to focus on at the end of verse 32. You endured a great conflict of suffering. That's the way my Bible, the New American Standard, says it. The NIV translates it, you stood your ground in a great contest in the face of suffering. It's very wordy, but the reason is the Greek here is difficult to translate because the author has put 2 images back to back, one athletic and one military. The athletic image, the idea of this great contest or this great struggle, is a wrestling term. And it says with much wrestling, that it's intense, it's hand to hand, and it's up close. This is in your face kind of stuff. But then he also uses a military term, and it deals with remaining on the field of battle, staying at your post, and not fleeing when the fighting gets hard. And that's why I think it says you stood your ground, you stayed at your post. There's the military idea. And it was in a great contest in the face of suffering. It was much wrestling. It was close, and it was intense, and it required endurance. I think the images back to back are meant to show that this was a time of intense exertion. These believers had been through a hard time. These Christians who are thinking about calling it quits, it's not because they're new believers. It's not because, wow, the first sign of suffering, they're ready to hightail it out of here. They've been fighting for a long time. These aren't new soldiers called to the front. These are seasoned warriors who've been in the face of hard battle. Verse 33, he goes more into detail into how they've endured this suffering. Look what it says in 33 and 34. It says, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. The first way they endured suffering is they experienced personal suffering. It says they did it, they were made a public spectacle through reproach and tribulations. Reproach is verbal attack. It's someone maligning or slandering, abusing you, calling you names. And they were made fun of. But more than that, it's physical. They endured tribulations. It has the idea of physical abuse. This got personal. It got into their bodies. Verse 34, it says they had their property and their possessions were taken away. It was financial, psychological, physical, financial suffering. This was big-time suffering that they're going through. But it wasn't just stuff they experienced themselves that they couldn't avoid. It wasn't like, well, I'm just being faithful with what I've got. It says they in verse 33, becoming sharers with those who were also treated. Literally means they stood side by side with others who were treated. In verse 34, it says they showed sympathy to prisoners. Not all of these believers were put in prison, but those who were not put in prison took care of the ones that were. And so they willingly exposed themselves by aligning themselves with those who had already received persecution. See, in those days, in the first century jail, you didn't get your 3 squares every day. If you wanted food, somebody from the outside, a family or a member or a friend would have to bring it into you. If no one cared for you, you'd starve to death because the jail wasn't going to provide for you. And what this is saying is that when someone was put in jail for their faith, others who shared the same faith and faced the same persecution were willing to come to the jail and take care of those who were in jail, letting people know, I'm one of them. And he says, you endured verbal abuse, physical abuse, financial loss, and you identified with others who did that as well. These believers were strong believers. There's an old saying I like. It says that a beautiful diamond is simply a lump of coal that has faithfully done its job for a long period of time under intense pressure. Isn't that good? A beautiful diamond is simply a lump of coal that has faithfully done its job over a long period of time under intense pressure. These people had done their jobs for an extended period of time under intense pressure. They were being made into beautiful diamonds of the church. These were the kind of believers, if they lived today, these were the kind of believers that would write a book. They would start a speaking ministry, and we'd all read the book, and we'd all go hear them speak. Because these guys had laid it on the line for Christ. But there's even more. Notice a fourth thing that he tells us. It's in verse 34. It says, "For you showed sympathy to the prisoners and accepted joyfully the seizure of your property." That not only were they willing to endure persecution, but they did so joyfully. They gladly sacrificed, it says, because they valued something greater than personal safety or financial reward. Paul Tripp is a current writer and speaker. In fact, he was here probably about a year ago. And he has a great illustration that he does. I really love it. He takes, many of you have probably heard it. He takes a bottle of water, just a regular bottle of water, and he unscrews the top. And he squeezes that bottle of water. And what happens when you squeeze a plastic bottle of water? Water comes out, doesn't it? It goes everywhere. I did this at the Tuesday Bible study in Louisville. I did this one time, took the top off. That's why I didn't do it up here. And I squeezed it, and I sprayed water all over this 85-year-old man in the front. Felt terrible. But water comes out, and he'll do that. He'll squeeze that water, and water comes out, and he'll say, "Why'd the water come out?" And people say, "Well, because you squeezed the bottle." And as soon as they say that, he'll take out another bottle. It's an empty bottle. And he'll unscrew the top, and with the same force, he'll squeeze that bottle. No water comes out. And he says, "Why'd no water come out?" And they say, "Well, there's no water in it." And he says, "Yes, that's the point. The point is not that the bottle is squeezed. I squeezed both bottles. The point is what is in the bottle. Water was in the bottle, and so it came out when I squeezed it." And I think his point is that suffering squeezes us. And whatever is inside of us, when we get squeezed, is going to come out. For these believers, it was joy. So if you're sick today, if you're dealing with marital trouble today, if you're dealing with relational issues at work or in the church or in your family today, those are pressures that are squeezing your heart. And if your spouse squeezes your heart and knows how to push your buttons and anger comes out, what your spouse may be doing may not be right, but the fact that anger came out is not her fault or it's not his fault. It's because there was something in your heart. There's an idol in your heart that you think, "I deserve something my spouse isn't giving me," or "I deserve something that my spouse shouldn't be doing what she is giving me or he is giving me." And anger comes out. Anger comes out not because I've been squeezed, but because anger's in my heart. If sickness or financial pressure, job stress causes fear or discouragement, it's because those things are in your heart. And suffering is there to show you what is in your heart. It's a sanctifying thing when it squeezes us. When Carrie was going through her cancer treatments, people would often see her, especially when she was doing chemo. Chemo's bad. There's just no way to say it. Chemo's awful. And when she was going through her cancer treatments, people would often say to her, you're so strong. And I can remember her saying to me over and over, she said, I don't feel strong. It was honestly, she would say, probably the weakest physically and emotionally time of her life. And she'd say, I don't feel strong. I know of other people who have said that same thing. I had a friend who wrote me and said, people say I'm strong. She was dealing with cancer as well. And she said, I don't feel strong. And I think what people are trying to say when they're saying you're strong is they're acknowledging the fact that cancer or job change, that's intense pressure on your heart. And these people that are going through that are being squeezed. And what everybody around sees is not strength, but they see what's coming out. Anger's not coming out. Complaining is not coming out. Despair is not coming out. I mean, those things certainly are there at times, but they're not characteristically coming out. What comes out is trust. What comes out is faithfulness. What comes out is a reliance upon God. And when people see that, they think, oh, you're so strong. But the person who's experiencing it says, I don't feel strong. I'm taking the next step. But I think what it is they're being squeezed, and what comes out is trust. When I think about Carrie and what she's been through, the reason those things come out of her heart this year when she's being squeezed with cancer is because I believe, I've seen her for years put those things in her heart for year upon year upon year. But there was an opportunity for so many people to see them because life was good, life was easy. And suffering gives a platform, an opportunity to display what is already there. So cancer has not made my wife more godly, but cancer has given an opportunity for her to display the godliness that was already there and for her to grow some in that. Marital trouble, job trouble, relational trouble, illness does not make you godly, but it gives you an opportunity to see what is in your heart. So what comes out of you when you're squeezed? And are you today doing things to put things in your heart so that when the pressure comes, the squeezing comes, the right things come out? When these people get squeezed, the author says, you were joyful. You were glad that this happened to you. But why is the author calling them to remember these things about their past? Is this a pep rally? Is he wanting them to be happy and to celebrate at what God's done in their life? I don't think so. The rest of the text suggests that's not the case. I think the reason the author in verses 32 to 34 focuses on their past is because he knows that the squeezing is continuing. And the squeezing is getting even more intense. And he's fearful that something else is going to come out of their heart. That discouragement is going to come out of their heart. And that leads to the second command in verse 35. And that is to stand firm in their present circumstance. Look at it with me. It says, therefore, do not throw away your confidence. Do not throw away your boldness, your commitment to Christ. Throwing away literally means to cast off or to drop something. It's used oftentimes in first century Greek for trees that would drop their leaves. That after a long, hot summer of life and growth and vitality and work, the tree is ready for dormancy, it's ready for rest, it's ready for sleep, and so it lets go, it drops those leaves. These believers in Hebrews have been through a hard, faithful, long season of suffering. And I think the author knows that they're growing weary. They're tired. They don't see things changing, and they're tempted to drop. They're tempted to throw away their commitment to Christ. New suffering's coming. Many people believe Hebrews is written to Jewish Christians in Rome right before the persecutions of Nero. If that's true, these Christians are about to face martyrdom. New suffering's coming. It's going to pile up on what they've already experienced. And he says, don't look at your circumstances. Don't grow weary. Don't quit. Don't drop. You stay faithful. Verse 36, he gives us the reason they are to stay faithful. He says, stay faithful because you have a need of endurance. That in spite of their suffering, they have a need for continued endurance. I think the reason is they've not quite become the diamond God intends them to be. They need more time. They need more pressure. They need more squeezing to become that which God wants them to be. There's more for them to learn. He goes on to say in verse 36, you have need for endurance so that when you've done it, you will have done the will of God. This suffering they are enduring and will continue to endure is the will of God. I think it's interesting in this verse, we're not given God's reasoning. We're not told why God lets these people suffer. There's no apology. There's no, gee, I wish you didn't have to suffer. But what this verse gives me is God's expectation of these believers. That was a hard word for me to say. God's expectation of these believers and his expectation of us when we do suffer. that we need to endure. We need to stand faithful. I had a seminary prof at DTS named Todd Mangum. I believe he was a graduate student at the time. He's one of my favorite seminary profs. But man, he was a killer grader. He was the hardest grader I've had in any program anywhere. And late in the semester, some of the other guys in the class went and talked to him and kind of complained about the grading. And I'll never forget what he said. He came to class the next day, and he teared up, had tears in his eyes, and he said, I know I'm very hard. And he said, I grade you hard purposefully, and I make no apologies about the way I grade. And he said, let me tell you, I'm responsible to train you men to be pastors. And he said, that is a high calling, and it demands rigorous preparation. And he said, so I am hard on you, but I'm purposefully hard on you, and I will not apologize. And where guys were wanting to get a lighter load, we got a lesson in life, I think. And I think what God is saying in verse 36, you have need of endurance. God makes no apologies. But ours is a high calling, and God is calling us to something, and He is making us into something that demands rigorous preparation. And that suffering in your life and in my life that we so want to get rid of is the time and the pressure that is making us into that jewel that He desires us to be. I'll tell you how that plays out in my life. Talk about Carrie's cancer. And, we started chemo probably late September, went through the holidays, and those were three and a half very hard months. After that, we went into radiation, 35 radiation treatments, and I say we. Carrie corrects me sometimes, says, hey, you were on the other side of the 3-foot iron door. We didn't go in to get shot with the radiation. So she endured the radiation. We as a family walked with her through that. But it was a hard time. Those were a hard 6 months. It's still a hard time. But what I found, that it was like a boxing match where you take a couple of hard blows to the face and you're staggering, just trying not to go down. And after the initial hit of that, I think as individuals, we were doing well. As a couple, we were doing well. Our marriage was strong. Our kids, our family was doing well. But you know what? Life doesn't stop. Life doesn't say, you know what? Y'all got cancer. We're just going to ease up on you. And it all kind of came to a head for me in March when I just made a list of a few things that happened right after spring break, about the third, fourth week of March. Our house, we had 5 appliances break down in about 6, 7, 8 days. And it was just one right after another. And if you know me, I'm anything but mechanical. I can find the gas can on my car, and that's it. I can't even do the oil. But we have these appliances break down. We're trying to do some remodeling at the house, and that wasn't going well. So our house was falling apart. The cars, it started to get warm, turned my air conditioning on in my car, and I realized, you know what? We're going to go with natural air conditioning this year. Then Carrie comes home and says, hey, my tires are worn out. So we put tires on the car. Not big things, but just one little thing after another that just builds up. It builds up. I was coaching baseball at the time. I was coaching a couple teams, and I'd committed to coach my middle son, Cal. I was coaching his team. I was his head coach. And after our second game, he broke his foot and thought, doggone it, I can't even. Now I'm coaching a team that I don't even have a kid playing for. Work issues here at the church. Honestly, it seemed that during that time, a new issue was arising every day. Not big things, not earth-shattering things, but little things, day after day after day after day. I began to feel like Job. I told Carrie, I said, I feel like Job, where in Job 1 and 2, when stuff starts happening to him, one servant comes and he announces this trouble, and he's not even done speaking, it says, before the next servant comes and announces his trouble. And then the next servant comes and says the dryer is broken, and then, I added that part. Then the next servant comes and says the lawnmower won't start. And it was just kind of that one after another after another after another. I thought I was doing okay with it until I was at a baseball game. I was coaching, and we were in the first inning. And an umpire blew a call. He really blew the call. And I went out on the field, and I talked with the umpire, and I appealed to his buddy. And they both said no, they weren't going to hear my appeal. And by God's grace, I was able to hold my tongue. Not always able to do that. I feel like it's confession hour. But in this instance, I was able to hold my tongue. But when I walked off the field, it was the first inning. And man, I just burned deep down in my gut. I was just frustrated. And I couldn't get rid of it. For the next hour and 45 minutes of that game, I just burned deep down in my gut over this call. At one point, usually when I'm coaching, I'm out on the field, I just had to go sit down and just say, you know what, I'm going to say something I'm going to regret. I better just sit down. And after the game, I remember going up to Carrie, and I said, you know, I can't even get a break of getting an umpire in a kid's game who knows baseball rules. I mean, I can't get any break. And then I said the words that I said in third grade, and I said at the top of the hill in the 5K, or for me, the 3.6K or whatever I ran. I said, you know what, I just want to quit. You know, I'm just ready to quit. I didn't know what I was going to quit. I didn't know how I was going to quit, but I was just ready to quit. And I imagine you guys have been there. And I'll admit, I take baseball too serious. I take sports too serious. I told the first hour, I didn't even mention in my bad March, Kentucky losing the national championship. You know, I mean, you want to talk about suffering, that's suffering. And that was just the way my March went. And I take baseball too serious, but it wasn't that game that was burning me up. It was all these things, one after another, after another, after another, after another. And I said, you know what? I'm ready to quit. It was the very next day that, I don't even remember what the circumstances were. It may have been I think I was talking with John Brown in my office, and this verse came to mind. For you have need of endurance. Mike, you have need of endurance. That's why this stuff's happening. None of this is happening outside of God's will. He may not be causing it, but he's certainly allowing it. Mike, you have need of endurance. And it's God's will that you go through this and you be faithful through this and you endure this. You know, I don't know what you're struggling with today. I'm sure your struggles are different than mine, but they're no less significant. Maybe a rocky marriage, challenges at work or church or illness or a job or a kid or a whole host of things. And I can tell you, God may not explain to you why he's allowing that into your life. God will never apologize for allowing that into your life. But I can tell you from Hebrews 10:36, the reason he's allowing it into your life is you have need of endurance. That God is seeking to do something in your life that he believes only can be done through suffering. And his expectation, he expects you to endure it faithfully. And that's hard to say. It's hard to live. But that's what he expects. I think that's what this passage says. And so in 32 to 34, he says, you remember your past. In 35 and 36, the reason I want you to remember your past is because you're about to quit, and I don't want you to quit. I want you to stand firm in your present. And then in 37 to 39, I want you to look to your future. I think he knows that the author who wrote this knows that it is easy to get discouraged and that we are made for hope. J.I. Packer says humans are hopers by nature, that hope motivates, it energizes, it drives us. So I think it's interesting that every time he speaks about their difficult situation in this passage, he motivates them by pointing to their future, their glorious future. Look at it. We kind of skipped over, but look at it with me now. In verse 35, when he says, don't drop your confidence, don't drop your boldness, it has a great reward. Remember, it has a reward. 36, you have need of endurance. You suck it up, is what he's saying. So that when you've done God's will, you will receive what is promised. There's the future. And then in 37 and 38, for yet in a very little while, he who is coming will come and not delay, but my righteous one will live by faith. The author looks at the Old Testament, he looks at Isaiah, and he looks at Habakkuk, and he says, I'm telling you to endure, but the endurance won't be forever. In fact, it's for a little while. And then Christ will come, and we will be with him. It's what Kendall pointed out today, that we will look at him face to face. Revelation 21:22 says, and we will be in his presence, and there won't be a temple, there won't be a sun, there won't be any of that, because he will be there. And we'll be with him. And that day's coming, and we have that hope. And so in 39, he finishes with a great comfort. He says, but we are not of those who shrink back to destruction. I think he's a pastor. The author of Hebrews is a pastor. And after giving this hard charge of you don't quit, you don't quit, you don't quit, he says, I know you're not going to quit. I know you're not going to quit. I know you're not going to shrink back. But we are those who have faith to the preserving of our soul. You're going to hang in there. I love the word shrink back. It's a nautical term, and it means to take in your sails, to lower your sails. And I think the idea is that suffering is this wind. It's a rough sea that you're being pushed on. And he's saying, don't lower your sails. God's trying to take you somewhere. He's trying to do something in you. And the worst thing you can do is to say, I quit. I'm going to waste this opportunity. I'm going to lower my sails, and I'm going to stay right where I am. And I'm just going to grow bitter, and I'm going to grow old. So do you see the text? Do you see the passage? Christians are not spared from suffering. And when suffering comes, God expects us to endure it, to faithfully endure it. I've repeated that phrase to myself 1,000 times since March. Mike, you have need of endurance. You have need of endurance. You have need of endurance. You may be saying that right now. You have need of endurance to listen to me. I don't know. But we have need of endurance. You know, when I quit running that 5K that day, I was not spared from anything. The race wasn't made any shorter. You know, that volunteer on the top of the hill didn't say, well, hang on, Mike quit. Mike quit. Let's make this a 2-mile race. Mike quit. We're going to stop it here. You know, the pain wasn't lessened. After Carrie passed me, I still had to run. And I still had the pain in my knees and in my side. The pain didn't get less. Nobody came to pick me up. Nobody came to just say, you've had a hard day. Let me carry you. I still had to finish. But it just took me longer to get to my destination, and when I got there, I was a lot more ashamed than I would have been had I just run. Quitting wasn't the answer in 3rd grade. Quitting wasn't the answer in a 5K, and quitting isn't the answer at a baseball game, and quitting isn't the answer today. There was a swimmer named Florence Mae Chadwick. You may be familiar with the story. In 1952, she was trying to be the first woman ever to swim from Catalina Island to California. 26-mile swim. She sat out, swam for 15 hours. After 15 hours, a dense fog settled in. She was feeling pain throughout her body, and that fog blurred her vision where she could only see a couple feet in front of her. She swam on for another hour before telling the people in the boats, I don't think I can press on. They pulled her out of the water, and as they paddled forward a little bit, she realized she was less than a mile from shore. 2 months later, she went back and she swam the same distance from Catalina Island to California. Took the same amount of time. Same pain set in. In fact, they said that night the same fog came and settled upon her. But she said when the pain got bad and the fog got thick, she had that mental image of the shoreline. And so she pressed on. She pressed ahead. And she was able to finish that course. I think in our lives, the journey of our life, it is going to be painful. And at times, the fog of circumstances will settle in, and it'll seem that you can't see your hand in front of your face. But I think God's expectation is that we have need of endurance, and we need to press on, and we live faithfully, step by step, day by day, and we have the mental image of Him and the glorious future to which we go, and it keeps us pressing on. And that is what we are called to. Will you pray with me? Father, it seems weird to preach a sermon on endurance in the 1st of June, a month that is given to graduations, that is given to weddings, that is given to celebration. But Father, I know that as many come in here to celebrate graduation, to anticipate weddings, that many others come in here carrying a heavy load, burdened by suffering. And God, I believe just as you've told me these last several months that you are telling each of us, we have need of endurance. And God, I pray that you would fix our eyes upon you, upon our future, that we would trust in you, and that we would stay faithful day by day until you call us home. And so, Father, we thank you. We thank you for your word, and we thank you for Christ, and it's in his name I pray. Amen.